Industrial is a term that's used to cover a huge range of sounds, everything from electronic dance to industrial metal to avant-garde and abrasive current artists like Kristen Hayter's Lingua Ignota project. I'm a music obsessive who's diving into early industrial music to find out more about the roots of the genre. So last time, I covered 7 bands I consider a good starting point. And now we're going to expand that list to cover some more of the early innovators of industrial scenes. Now originally I wanted to tell the whole story of industrial in these 2 videos, but this genre is just too fucking big, and I decided why rush it. So I'm going to stick with early industrial artists for now, covering some more influential bands that were around before about 1982. I'm Michael, and this is Eclecticism. Prepare yourself for some bad attempts at German. Someone asked a good question in the comment section of the last video. How do I actually define industrial? I'm not much of a gatekeeper, so often if I hear other people talking about a band as fitting within a genre, I'll just think of them that way without really thinking too much about it. But if I really had to sum up what makes a band feel industrial to me, tape loops. These can be musical, found sounds, mechanical noises, or even audio samples of voices or clips from movies. It often includes other processed or distorted sounds. For instance, Throbbing Gristle had a keyboard called the Gristleizer, where different sound samples were linked to each key, and these sound samples could be played in a live setting. B, the DIY spirit. Here's the connection to the punk attitude that influenced industrial. Punk brought about this idea that you could start a band if you could play 3 chords. Industrial brought about the idea that you don't need to be able to play a chord at all. You could play a block of iron, or a metal tube, or a big ol' hunk of beef. This is an extension and an elaboration on the idea that music isn't only for the elite or those who have received training. And this overlaps with 3 non-traditional instruments. And then 4, electronics. Most of what falls into industrial will use some combination of these elements, but like a lot of genres, as time goes on, I do think part of it is just a vibe, just music that connects with a certain community. Does it share aesthetic similarities with the industrial that's come before, even if it takes it in a new direction? So that's why we have industrial dance, we have industrial metal. The line between industrial and post-punk or noise are kind of vague. If you disagree that some of these bands are industrial, we really don't need to fight about it. Just recognize the purpose of this video, and this channel really, is just to make people curious about new music, and to try out new things. Okay, so on to the first band. Nurse with Wound began as a trio, and didn't consider themselves an industrial band. That's a theme on this list. They had no affiliation with Industrial Records or Throbbing Gristle, but the band leader, Steven Stapleton, did have a connection to Peter Christopherson in his other job, the design studio Hypnosis. Stapleton was doing some graphic design and sign painting work for Hypnosis, and at one point brought up how much he liked the creaking and squeaking noises coming from a folding chair at the studio. They gave him the chair, and Stapleton has claimed that he's used it in every Nurse with Wound album since that point. Every album would amount to over 40, many with collaborators. The first 4 albums were experimental trio recordings, which were influenced by krautrock and improvisational experimental music. The first album came about when Stapleton was talking to Nick Rogers, a studio engineer, and Rogers was complaining about how boring he found most of the stuff that was being recorded in the studio. Stapleton said he had an experimental band, and they'd be happy to come in and record there. Rogers accepted, and then Stapleton had to actually make a band, which he did. He found 2 friends who didn't have instruments and couldn't play. They tracked down some instruments though, and then they all went to the studio without having practiced, and in 6 hours they'd made their first album, titled Chance Meeting on a Dissecting Table of a Sewing Machine and an Umbrella. In addition to the unusual free-form music, this album got attention because of what's become known as the Nurse with Wound list. This was a sheet of paper included with the first album, and it included a list of 291 experimental artists and musicians who Nurse with Wound were inspired by. This included elders of experimental music like Captain Beefheart and Frank Zappa, some other industrial groups like Cabaret Voltaire and DAF, some great rock and opposition groups like Universe Zero and Henry Cow. The background in how this first album came together might be why my first thought on hearing it was that it was basically free jazz. Stapleton no longer thinks of those first 4 albums made as a trio as the real Nurse with Wound, which would start once he was experimenting on his own. Album 5, Homotopy to Marie, feels much more industrial, with a range of strange noises and occasional instruments, looped spoken word dialogue, and a looped and distorted sample of what sounds like marching soldiers, forming the closest thing to a rhythm in one of the tracks. Since these beginnings, Nurse with Wound has explored far and wide, with an incredibly far-reaching experimental career. To get a sense of some high points, I would recommend the last two discussed albums, then Soliloquy for Lilith, Drunk with the Old Man of the Mountains, and Who Can I Turn to Stereo? But do take my picks with a grain of salt, since I've heard only a small portion of what Stapleton's put out, and I'm honestly not the biggest fan. I often find the projects interesting, but not as much as a lot of the artists on this list, and not enough that I return to them a lot. Regardless of that, Nurse with Wound's importance to experimental music has to be acknowledged. Now, let's get out of the rain and head down to Australia for two early industrial pioneers. First, we have SPK, who formed in Sydney in '78. Creating their own take on experimental music, they were influenced by Kraftwerk, Can, Neu, and Faust, showing a similar connection to the experimentation of krautrock that we've seen from several other industrial bands. Their name came from a radical Marxist collective that both of SPK's founders were influenced by, the Socialist Patience Collective. And throughout their career, they kept changing what the SPK in their names stood for: System Planning Corporation, Seppuku, Surgical Penis Clinic, and others. They relocated to the UK, where they recorded their first album, Information Overload Unit. This is a dark, abrasive, and powerful album that sometimes goes full-on noise, like the almost painful beginning of the album, where it sounds like you're first being sucked into a dial-up internet connection, then it sounds like you're trapped in the midst of aggressive TV static. But with SPK, there's sometimes a clear rhythm, even if it's not being made by traditional means. And even if there's not, I can always find a structure, and I find their tapestries of noise and distortion fascinating. I found myself coming back to their first couple albums a lot, and I really want to explore them more. In addition to Information Overload Unit, I'd recommend Leischen Schrei, their second album. This has a reputation as a darker or even scary sort of album. For whatever reason, it doesn't really hit me that way. Maybe it's because there's an audio sample on this album I cannot listen to without literally laughing out loud.
Tried to give me syphilis by wiping his cock on my sandwich.
But it does build upon their first album, creating pieces that are industrial and creating a tension through these two side-long tracks. On streaming services, these have now been broken into shorter tracks, but it's still an experience of two tracks that flow through different little movements. SPK was unfortunately a short-lived project. Neil Hill, one of the two founding members, died in '84. The band continued until '87, with their last couple releases feeling a bit less industrial. And '86's Zamia Lemani, Songs of Byzantine Flowers, is a gorgeous cinematic ambient album, which foreshadows what was coming next. In '87, the band dissolved, and the other founding member, Graham Revell, went on to compose film scores, including The Crow, The Craft, Street Fighter, and Sin City. But SPK wasn't the only weird-ass Aussie export to have a big impact on industrial. There was also the man, the myth, the legend, the fetus. J.D. Thirlwell went by more names than most musicians have albums. Fetus Under Glass, You've Got Fetus on Your Breath, Scraping Fetus Off the Wheel, Fetus Incorporated, Fetus Interruptus, and then Fetus. And later on Manorexia, Wise Blood, occasionally he even went by J.D. Thirlwell. He has over 30 releases, but we're going to focus on his early career here. He came from Melbourne, Australia, and he moved to London in '78. There, he was in a post-punk band, Pragvek, and during that time was already working on his own solo material as Fetus Under Glass. It's hard to describe the music of Fetus, even if you're focusing on just one era or just one album. It's like dozens of genres have been thrown into a blender and you're watching them spin around in a gory mess, with Thirlwell's vocals that have a gritty, sometimes Tom Waits-like quality to them, crooning through the chaos. At times it's industrial, and the aggression of the music definitely feels akin to industrial music, but what Thirlwell does goes beyond any genre boundaries you could put on it. I'd recommend starting with Nail from '85, which is still broad in scope, but it has a couple great songs that feel specifically industrial. The opener, for example, Theme from Pigdom Come. But then you have The Throne of Agony, which sounds a bit like dark cabaret. And then Descent into the Inferno has a lounge jazz swagger, and synths imitating a horn section with backing vocals that are literally scatting. It's wildly inventive, fun, weird, and ridiculous. The album right before that, Hole, was released in '84, and it was a little bit less popular than Nail, but I like it just as much. If anything, it has more doo-wop and cabaret, and the boundaryless experimentation is, to my ears, just a non-stop flood of fun. I've listened to most of the Fetus releases, and on the first couple listens to each one, I can't really identify weak points. Different albums experiment in different ways, but I find them all interesting. For example, the debut, Death, has a couple songs that sound like he's channeling Prince. So Nail and Hole, from Scraping Fetus Off the Wheel, are a great starting point. But if you like what you're hearing there's a whole lot more where those came from. Thirlwell never considered his work industrial, and the same can be said of this next band, who I think of as more of an experimental rock band than an industrial one. But there's definitely a historical connection, and some similarities with industrial, despite the band feeling more rock than anything we're going to talk about in the rest of the video. Chrome was formed in San Francisco, California in '76. Damon Edge was a founder of the band and a band leader until his death in '95. The key period when it comes to industrial influence began with their second album, '77's Alien Soundtracks. This is a bit psychedelic and has some definite punk influence you can hear. It reminds me of the Stooges some of the time. But they also explore ambient droning sounds, they're using tape loops, and they use found instruments in the making of the album as well, so there's a lot of crossover. The key element to industrial that's missing for me is the aggressive feeling. It feels a bit too cheerful to match the vibe of anything I consider strictly industrial. I literally started this video saying I'm not a gatekeeper, but I guess I'm a little bit of one. The way they explore sound on Alien Soundtracks has some links to industrial, but this is industrial rock where the rock part is more emphasized. On the follow-up, Half Machine Lip Moves, there's a push even further into the experimentation of their sound. The second track, Zombie Warfare, has a skeletal and metallic rhythm and squealing noise over the top, and some weird tinny and partially buried vocals that feel like a style I've heard emulated by some noise rock bands more recently. It's still rock music, but here I feel like the rock is less of the focus than seeing what weird things they can do sonically. So they're not strictly industrial in the sense of these other bands, but I do recommend hearing these albums, especially if you're also a fan of things like noise rock or post-punk. But now, for something completely different, let's get our dance on with DAF. DAF, which is short for Deutsche Amerikanische Freundschaft. Deutsche Amerikanische Freundschaft. They formed in '78 as a duo of Gabby Delgado Lopez and Robert Gorel. They quickly expanded to a 5-piece, and their first album is a very wild experimental industrial album that feels closer to artists like SPK than what they'd end up doing later on. Their third album saw them pairing the band back to the original duo. Alles ist gut sees them embracing a rhythmic, harsh dance sound, with Gabby's vocals often chanted or barked or spoken, never really sung. It feels like a harsh, mechanized dance music that feels industrial quite literally, like brutalist new wave. Alles ist gut is an album I'd very much recommend if you're curious about industrial dance. And same with its follow-up, Gold und Liebe. The band in this early era stood out from new wave and dance bands for a couple big reasons. First, the live show was very light on instruments, with one band member on drums and the other on vocals, and someone else taking care of the electronic elements. This minimal stage presence, combined with their imagery of wearing black leather, dancing, sweating, showing off their arms and chests, you see where this is going, right? They were doing for industrial what Judas Priest did for metal, sneaking in a little bit of gay culture. There's been a long association between EBM and a sort of tough guy persona, but for DAF, they've been explicit about it having come from a very different source, gay S&M clubs. And DAF wasn't the only band to help form this merging of industrial with dance music that would go on to become EBM a little later. Front 242 started in Belgium in '81. From the first single, they were producing a cold, minimal dance music that would be a major influence on electronic body music. The term electronic body music had previously been used by Ralf Hütter of Kraftwerk to describe their music. And Kraftwerk, am I getting that right? Kraftwerk was a massive influence on electronic music as a whole, from electro to early hip-hop. But for what we now think of as EBM, Front 242 seems to me like the clearest starting point for where that style feels fully formed. So right out of the gate, Front 242's debut album, Geography, takes characteristics of industrial, but creates driving and repetitive rhythms to pair with their minimal and electronic dance music. Vocals are often harshly barked or spoken, which is often the most harsh element of the sounds. Their sound's actually quite distinct from what Daft was doing at this point, yet the main characteristics, if you boil them down, are very similar. And if we compare this to earlier industrial music, we have a distinct change. In fact, many fans of the earlier avant-garde and confrontational music consider this something entirely different. So are we still even talking about industrial? Well, if not, where are we going to draw the line? Throbbing Gristle has songs with dance beats, and so does Einstürzende Neubauten. We discussed Esplendor Geometrico in the last video, who are making a skeletal, industrial, with a clear dance beat underneath. Then there are bands like CHBB and Liaisons Dangereuses, who help to form a through line between the noise of early industrial and the dance beats of EBM. And Front 242 once described their sound as a merging of Throbbing Gristle with Kraftwerk, a blending of industrial with other mechanical dance music. So it's linked, but there's a reason it developed its own name and its own identity. It takes some elements of industrial and moves it in a new direction. Similar to how in the 80s, you have metal branching off into a variety of different directions like black metal, death metal, and thrash. But back to Front 242, Geography was already a confident step into industrial dance, but 88's Front by Front shows them at the heights of their powers. They've at this point fully found and finessed their sound into something that feels more precise, and now feels worlds away from their influences. This is rhythmic, repetitive, but with rich textures that keep it always engaging. Some actual singing in the vocals, but also some harsh delivery. There's a refinement to it, and even when it gets more aggressive, I'd rarely call it genuinely noisy in the same way as even their earlier work. Here we have more of a well-oiled and streamlined machine, something that's mechanically precisely tuned, not the reflection of collapse or urban decay that earlier industrial was often commenting on. But now, let's move back to the noisier, the more avant-garde side of things, with another UK band, Nocturnal Emissions. Nocturnal Emissions is mainly the project of Nigel Ayers, who before forming this project had majored in sculpture. After graduating, he did what you do with an art degree, and he got a job at a petrol station. But not long after, he had the good fortune to meet Cabaret Voltaire, who invited him to come to London and do some recording. And London's where the Nocturnal Emissions project came together. By his second release, he created his first label, Sterile Records, and he was very prolific with these early releases, experimenting with tapes and synths. He explored musique concrète and noise in a way that can be seen as related to industrial, although he's always dismissed the idea that Nocturnal Emissions are actually an industrial project. As Ayers said in an interview with The Quietus, we've only really been linked to that because we use electronics. An interesting early project is 83's Drowning in a Sea of Bliss. This is a collage of samples and noise and synth rhythms that is not one of the more accessible releases I'm going to cover. In fact, I find this one harsher than SPK's Leichenschrei at times, but it's always engaging and interesting. Drowning in a Sea of Bliss feels similar to some industrial works of the early era, but for something completely different and very good, check out 88's Spirit Flesh. This album is more of a dark ambient project, and it would have fit perfectly in my spooky ambient albums for Halloween video. It's a constantly evolving soundscape full of strange, eerie sounds. It feels both organic and mechanical, with strange churning sounds, chirping synths that sometimes sound like birds in the distance. Some sort of distortion is done on some of these sounds to evoke the feeling of being in a cave with sounds echoing through the caverns, like on the track Cloud Can. For me, this album's moved away from feeling like industrial, partially because the sounds, regardless of how they were made, evoke nature. That's what I hear when I listen to this. This one has become one of my favorite new discoveries during my dive into industrial that I've been on for the last 6 or 7 weeks. Nigel Ayers has over 40 releases all the way up to the present, but there's one more that's definitely not industrial that I just have to mention because I've been obsessed with it for years. Hank and Slim is the name used by Nigel Ayers and Robin Story when they teamed up to make a stunning album of what I think of as cowboy ambient music. Robin Story is a member of another industrial band I've not gotten to yet, Soviet France. Hank and Slim's one album, The World Turned Gingham, feels like the ambient music of a barely visited gas station in the middle of New Mexico. And when I first found this album, I went on a mission to find as much cowboy or western ambient music as I could. But it's not really industrial in any meaningful sense, just an eclectic weirdo album you should check out, and it's on Bandcamp. And there will be a link to the Bandcamp page in the description. So there we go. Another set of highly influential early industrial artists that you should explore if you're wanting to get into industrial music. I do plan to circle back to industrial after covering some other topics, so let me know what further topics you'd want to see me focus on. Do you want to hear about my favorite newer industrial bands? See a focus on cold wave or EBM, maybe industrial metal, or some other related subgenre? But up next, I'll be exploring dark folk music, talking about neo-folk, and I'll also be covering shoegaze soon. So if you want to explore some more music with me, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop a comment below so we can talk about music. Thanks for watching Eclecticism, and I'll see you next time.